Welcome back to Conversations with the Great Minds. Tonight I'm speaking with evolutionary scientist Richard Dawkins, whose work has made him a leading figure in new atheism. Professor Dawkins' new book, The Magic of Reality, How We Know What's Really True, will be released in the United States on October 4th. And Professor Dawkins, welcome back. Your new book, The Magic of Reality, How We Know What's Really True, and some of your other works on the God delusion, for example. You were Well, actually, let me go to The Magic of Reality first. This is just a beautifully illustrated book and makes science so accessible to basically people of any age. You asked the first question of the first chapter, what is reality? What is magic? Is almost an existential question. You want to take a whack at that?
Well, this is a book designed for young people primarily, but actually for all ages. And I'm trying to make the point that magic, as in the sense of supernatural magic, magic spells, as in fairy tales and miracles and Harry Potter and things, that reality, real science, where there aren't any miracles, is much more exciting and much more magical in the good sense of the sort of poetic magic, when we say it's magical looking up at the Milky Way at night, that kind of thing. So I'm trying to show that myths can be fun, and there are plenty of myths in the book, but science is better. Science is more interesting, more fascinating, more enthralling, and that takes reality seriously. We don't have miracles, we don't have supernatural spells, we don't have magic in that sense. What we have is reality, which is magical, is wonderful, and we study it by the methods of science.
And speaking of reality and magic, and I would put probably most religions in the category of magic, or perhaps you do. In the UK, you have religious fundamentalists, but they're largely politically marginalized. Here in the United States, basically the religious fundamentalists have become a portal through which candidates for the presidency must pass, particularly on the Republican side. Do you think this may have something to do with your country having had the experience of religious zealots like Cromwell and Guy Fawkes, whereas here they've never created a full-out theocracy?
It's very difficult to know. It's a curious anomaly, because if you look worldwide, religion is pretty much a third world problem. Religion goes with lack of education, goes with poverty, it goes with despair. And I mean, that's why in Western Europe religion is dying, all except for the Muslims, but in Christendom, in Western Europe, Christendom, religion is dying because of prosperity and everything that one would think that America has, and indeed does have. And yet half of America, very nearly half, is not only religious, but preposterously so. I mean, 40% of the American electorate actually believe that the world is only 6,000 years old, or less than 10,000 years old, which is a quite ludicrous error. It's not a slight error, it's a massive error. And this is something which stands out like a sore thumb. I mean, you expect to find that in Islamic countries, and you do. You expect to find that in Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan and so on. You do not expect to find it in the richest and most highly educated country in the world. But I think you possibly can get a clue to it by noticing that those parts of the United States which are most influenced by this kind of fundamentalism tend to be those parts that are less well educated, that are less prosperous, less looked after, and so there might be a tendency for people who have who don't have a very nice life for one reason or another to turn to religion as a kind of refuge. And that's one theory that I've heard advanced. There are others. I mean, another theory is that because the United States has a constitution in which church and state is very rigidly separated, unlike in Western Europe, where many countries, including Britain, have an established church. And because we have an established church, it's been argued, religion has become sort of boring. A church is a place you go to be married and to be buried, but otherwise you don't go to church. But in America, where there is a constitutional separation between church and state, perhaps this has freed up religion to become free enterprise and to use all the sort of tricks of capitalism, of advertising and so on. And that may be why it's taken such a hold of the less educated classes in America.
And not only that, we give them complete tax breaks. So you end up with
tax breaks are just shocking. I mean, yes, indeed.
Yeah, so you end up with people like Pat Robertson, who's a billionaire with a B as a result of this. I'm curious if our genes are controlling our behavior, and many people have had experiences that they would describe as deeply spiritual, and thus maybe draw them to religion. Why would such a gene echo down through the generations?
Well, it's a difficult thing to say that genes control us. We are very much influenced by our education, by our environment. So I'm not sure that I would want to ask that in a sort of genetic way. It's probably true, as we said earlier on in our conversation. I mean, genes do influence brains, and brains are what decide whether you're going to be religious or not. And so there might be a genetic component in whether you are, in whether you tend to be drawn to religion. Now, you mentioned the word spiritual, and that's a much misused word, because people often use spiritual to mean the kind of thing that I mean by the magic of reality, the kind of thing I mean by looking up at the stars and being filled with wonder, being filled with joy at seeing the stupendous sight of the universe, or looking down a microscope, or thinking, or going to the Grand Canyon and looking down through the layers of geological time. I mean, that's magical in the sense of the magic of reality, and you could even call that spiritual. But I rather resent the hijacking of that. Call it spiritual if you like, I prefer not to. I rather resent the hijacking of that feeling, which I feel, and which any of my scientist friends feel, hijacking by religion. It is not a monopoly of religion. We all feel it, or we all are capable of feeling it.
This is the human condition. Very well said. In the God delusion, you're asserting that a supernatural creator doesn't exist, and that belief in a personal God qualifies as a delusion. Do you also make that argument for the belief in any sort of consciousness beyond the individual? For example, could it be that the universe itself is a conscious organism and we're one expression of it within it? Or for that matter, what is consciousness?
Well, I don't know what consciousness is, and it's a very difficult philosophical question. I don't think it's probably going to be helpful to talk about the universe as a whole being conscious. I know that some rather mystical philosophers have suggested something like that. I think that whatever consciousness is, it's manifested by brains. It's something to do with brains, or the functional equivalent of brains. I mean, I wouldn't rule out that one day somebody might build an electronic computer which was programmed in such a way that it was conscious. That seems to me to be actually quite likely. But it comes from very, very complex organization, such as the brain, which is an extremely complicated organization of billions of neurons. And if anybody makes a computer that's conscious, that again will be extremely complicated with many, many, many units, electronic units. So no, I don't think it's helpful to think that consciousness resides in the universe as a whole. I think consciousness is something that emerges by the evolutionary process in the universe, wherever in the universe brains, or something functionally equivalent to brains, evolve.
Do you think it's conceivable that as the internet and the number of computers connected to it begins to approach numbers that are similar to the number of axons and ganglions and synapses in the brain, that the internet itself may, you said consciousness emerges from it, that consciousness may emerge from the internet?
That is a fascinating science fiction speculation, and before we laugh it away, we should remember that that's pretty much what did happen in the evolution of brains, because brains started off as very simple nervous systems, and then the simple nervous systems got bigger and bigger and bigger, more and more interconnected in complicated ways, and that is what's happening to the internet. And so I wouldn't absolutely rule out the possibility that sometime in the future something like the internet, probably very different from the way the internet is now, but something like the internet, a global network of electronic connections between computing devices all over the world, might develop something like the same properties as the brain evolved millions of years ago.
It'd be quite remarkable to one day turn your computer on and have it say, "Well, hello there, Professor. How was your tea this morning?"
I'm sure that's already possible. I'm sure that's already possible.
But I mean, with intent,
it would be a bit of a trick. It would be a bit of a fake.
But with worldwide intent. Back to your book, the Magic of Reality. We have just 2 minutes left here, and I want to be sure to. You ask a number of great questions in here. Who was the first person, for example?
Well, yes. I mean, that's chapter 2 of the book. Every chapter in the book is a question like that.
Yes.
And every chapter begins with myths and then goes into the science. So who really was the first person? Well, there never really was a first person, because every animal ever born was of the same species as its parents. And so there never was a first Homo sapiens born to a Homo erectus parent. It all happened gradually. But if you stick together enough generations going back into the past, then you'll find a gradual turning into apes and monkeys and shrews and going back to fish and beyond. So we are descended from fish. But every single creature that was ever born is of the same species, was of the same species as its parents. The process is so gradual, rather like the movement of the hour hand of your watch. You can't see it move, but if you wait long enough, you see that it has moved.
Professor, it's extraordinary. We have just only 30 seconds left. The main message that you would want our viewers to know about your work.
I'm passionate about the truth, and the truth can be ascertained by science, by evidence. Never believe anything until you've seen the evidence.
That's brilliant. Professor Richard Dawkins, thank you so very much.
Thank you very much.
I was at first as outraged as everybody else by the Pope's opening remarks as soon as he landed in Edinburgh, blaming atheists for the atrocities of Hitler and the others of the 20th century. But then I took comfort from it, because it seemed to me that in a way it was showing that we had rattled them so much that he was forced to the ignominious expedient of attacking us so as to divert attention from the real crimes that had been committed in the name of the Catholic Church. I can just imagine the discussions in the corridors of Vatican power. How are we going to distract them from buggering boys? And the answer came, why don't we attack secularists? Why don't we attack atheists? Why don't we blame them for Hitlerism? Adolf Hitler, was a Roman Catholic. He was baptized, he never renounced his baptism. The figure of 5 million British Catholics is presumably obtained from baptismal figures. I don't believe a word of it. I don't believe there are 5 or 6 million British Catholics. There may be 5 or 6 million who have been baptized, but if the Church wants to claim them as Catholics, then they have to claim Hitler as a Catholic. At very least, Hitler believed in a personified providence. He often spoke of it, and it was presumably the same providence that was invoked by the Cardinal Archbishop of Munich in 1939, when Hitler escaped assassination and the Cardinal ordered a special Te Deum in Munich Cathedral, quote, to thank divine providence in the name of the Archdiocese for the Führer's fortunate escape. I'm going to read a speech made in Munich, the heart of Catholic Bavaria, in 1922, and I leave you to guess whose speech it is. My feeling as a Christian points me to my Lord and Saviour as a fighter. It points me to the man who once in loneliness, surrounded by a few followers, recognized these Jews for what they were and summoned men to fight against them, and who, God's truth, was greatest not as a sufferer but as a fighter. In boundless love as a Christian and as a man, I read through the passage which tells how the Lord at last rose in his might and seized the scourge to drive out of the temple the brood of vipers and adders. How terrific was his fight against the Jewish poison. Today, after 2,000 years, with deepest emotion, I recognize more profoundly than ever before the fact that it was for this that he had to shed his blood upon the cross. That was one of numerous speeches by Adolf Hitler, passages in Mein Kampf, where Adolf Hitler invoked his own Roman Catholic Christianity. No wonder he received such warm support from within the Catholic hierarchy of Germany. Even if Hitler had been an atheist, as Stalin more surely was, how dare Ratzinger suggest that atheism has any connection whatsoever with their horrific deeds? Any more than Hitler's and Stalin's non-belief in leprechauns or unicorns, any more than their sporting a moustache along with Franco and Saddam Hussein. There is no logical pathway from atheism to wickedness, unless, that is, unless you are steeped in the vile obscenity at the heart of Catholic theology. I refer to the doctrine of original sin. These people believe, and they teach this to tiny children, at the same time as they teach them the terrifying falsehood of hell, that every baby is born in sin. That would be Adam's sin, by the way. Adam, who, as they themselves now admit, never actually existed. Original sin means that from the moment we are born, we are wicked, corrupt, damned, unless we believe in their God, or unless we fall for the carrot of heaven and the stick of hell. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the disgusting theory that leads them to presume that it was godlessness that made Hitler and Stalin the monsters that they were. We are all monsters unless redeemed by Jesus. What a revolting, depraved, inhuman theory to base your life on. That's the theory of benefit. Joseph Ratzinger is an enemy of humanity. He's an enemy of children whose bodies he's allowed to be raped and whose minds he is encouraged to be infected with guilt. It's embarrassingly clear that the Church is less concerned with saving child bodies from rapists than with saving priestly souls from hell, and most concerned with saving the long-term reputation of the Church itself. He's an enemy of gay people, bestowing on them the sort of bigotry that his church used to reserve for Jews before 1962. He's an enemy of women, barring them from the priesthood, as though a penis were an essential tool for pastoral duties. He's an enemy of truth, promoting barefaced lies about condoms not protecting against AIDS, especially in Africa. He's an enemy of the poorest people on the planet, condemning them to inflated families that they cannot feed, and so keeping them in the bondage of perpetual poverty. A poverty which sits ill beside the obscene wealth of the Vatican. He's an enemy of science, obstructing vital stem cell research on grounds not of true morality, but of pre-scientific superstition. Ratzinger is even an enemy, he's even an enemy of the Queen's own church, arrogantly dissing Anglican orders as, quote, absolutely null and utterly void, while at the same time shamelessly trying to poach Anglican vicars to shore up his own pitifully declining priesthood. Finally, perhaps of most personal concern to me, Ratzinger is an enemy of education. Quite apart from the lifelong psychological damage caused by the guilt and fear that have made Catholic education infamous throughout the world, he and his church foster the educationally pernicious doctrine that evidence is a less reliable basis for belief than faith, tradition, revelation, and authority. His authority.
Will now introduce Richard Dawkins.
Don't worry, I will be brief. We all want to hear Richard talk. You know already that he's a world-renowned evolutionary biologist, that he taught many years at Oxford, and that the last 3 years of that was chair of public understanding of science. And public understanding means that he does not talk down to us, but instead he wants to raise us up to his level. He tries to do that, and we try to comply with that as much as possible. You know that he's written a string of best-selling books that, and I've been teaching English for 30 years now on the university level, and for the compelling elegance of his language and his subject matter, I give Richard Dawkins an A+. You know that his seminal work, The Selfish Gene, changed the way scientists view natural selection, and that it has sold more than 1 million copies and has been translated into more than 25 languages. Richard Dawkins has been inducted into the Royal Society of Science, which includes such lesser luminaries as Sir Isaac Newton and Charles Darwin. But did you know he was also inducted into the Royal Society of Literature? What a wonderful blending of arts and sciences that is. Well, what's he like on a personal level? 12 years ago, he asked if he could read one of my Darwin poems to the audience when he was being inducted into the Royal Society of Science. There's your arts and sciences together again. I thought that was an extremely nice thing for him to do, and we've been steadfast friends ever since. As busy as he is, to take out time to be a friend to somebody over here in Kentucky. Well, I'm here to testify that he's one of the most caring, kind, and compassionate human beings that you could ever hope to meet. And he's most generous of himself and of his resources. The foundation that he has founded gives thousands and thousands of dollars for disaster relief around the world. But the most important thing you need to know about Richard Dawkins is that he is not a delusion. He's here in flesh and blood. A big Eastern Kentucky welcome for Richard Dawkins.
Dot, and thank you everybody. Dot and I have been pen friends for a very long time, but amazingly this is the first day we have actually met in person, though we've been corresponding for many years. Now we have another rumble going on. Did anybody else hear it?
Yes,
I was delighted to hear Sean Fairclough's speech and to welcome him to the Richard Dawkins Foundation His book, you see there, is on display at the back and on sale, and he'll be signing it alongside me signing my books at the end. My own book, The Magic of Reality, written with 12-year-olds in mind, as you might guess from the fact that it's illustrated, heavily illustrated, but it's actually a book for all ages. Maybe one could even say a book for the ages. There are 12 chapters. Most chapters follow the same format. Each chapter begins with a question like, what is the sun? Who was the first person? What is a rainbow? What is an earthquake? Each chapter begins with myths about the subject, myths about the sun, myths about earthquakes, and so on. And then we get to the main part of the chapter, which is the science. What really is the sun? What really is a rainbow? What really is an earthquake? The first chapter introduces the idea of magic, which I divide into three. Supernatural magic, Cinderella's fairy godmother turning a pumpkin into a coach, or frogs turning into a prince. Illusion, conjuring, stage magic, which of course is just tricks. And finally, poetic magic, the one that I mean in my title. We're moved to tears by a beautiful piece of music, and we describe the performance as magical. We gaze up at the stars on a dark night with no light pollution. Breathless with joy, we say the sight of the Milky Way is pure magic. We use the same word to describe sunset over Grand Canyon, or an alpine landscape, or a rainbow against a dark sky. In this sense, magical just means moving, exhilarating, something that gives us goosebumps, something that makes us feel more fully alive. What this book tries to show is that reality, the facts of the real world, as understood through the methods of science, reality is magical in this third sense, the poetic sense, the good to be alive sense. Supernatural magic. It isn't just that frogs, as a matter of fact, don't turn into princes. There's a deeper reason why supernatural magic cannot happen. Frogs and princes and coaches are complicated things with many parts that need to be put together in a special way, a special pattern that doesn't just happen by accident. If they're not put together in that special pattern, they just don't work. Complicated means statistically improbable. And I'm talking about statistically improbable in a specific direction which you can specify in advance as being good for something. In the case of a prince, I'm not really sure what that's good for, but... Let's make it a bit easier for Cinderella's fairy godmother by supposing that instead of calling for a pumpkin, she had called for all the parts you need for assembling a coach. An IKEA kit for making a coach. All the planks of wood, panes of glass, pots of glue, screws, nuts, and so on. Shake them all up in a bag, and then go on shaking and see whether in a million years what you'll get is a working coach. And of course, you won't. The odds against are too great, the number of parts are too great, the different ways of combining them are too great, and only one of them will work. Sometimes we can literally count the number of ways you can reshuffle a series of bits, and the sort of classical mathematical way of doing it is with a pack of cards. Suppose we're playing bridge, and each of 4 players is dealt 13 cards at random. I pick up my cards, and I gasp with astonishment because I find that I have a perfect hand in spades. I lay my cards on the table and say, well, I've won this round. And then, one by one, the other 3 players lay down their hands, and each one of them has a perfect hand. Would this be supernatural magic? We might be tempted to think so. It could just happen, however. Mathematicians can calculate the chance of such a remarkable deal happening by luck. And it turns out to be, as I'm sure you've all worked out in your head by now, 536 octillion, 447 septillion, 737 sextillion, 765 quintillion, 488, don't even try this. 792 trillion, 839 billion, 237 million, 444,000. If you sat down and played cards, cards for 1 trillion years and you might on one occasion get a perfect deal like that. But actually, of course, that deal is no more unlikely than every other deal of cards that's ever been dealt. It's just that this particular one is special. We notice it. We don't notice all the others because they're just ordinary. Living things are very much not ordinary. They're not ordinary in the sense that they work. They fly, they swim, they dig, they pursue, they escape, they climb trees, they do things which are very, very improbable. And that could not come about by chance, that cannot come about by sheer random luck. It was the genius of Charles Darwin to realize how you could get organized complexity, statistical improbability on a staggering scale in the direction of usefulness in all sorts of different ways depending upon the species, but in general usefulness in surviving and reproducing. And Darwin's secret, of course, was not randomness, but the non-random process of natural selection. Spread out over many generations, there is a random element called mutation. Mutation is random, but each mutational step is not all that improbable, not too improbable to have come about by chance. When you have a large number of generations of mutation, each one random but then non-randomly selected in a cumulative fashion, then you get the prodigies of adaptive complexity which we recognize as living things.
Okay, folks, we're going up a very steep hill, and hopefully the traffic opens up, but I have some good news for you. I have some very good news for you if you're a Christian, some very bad news for you if you're an atheist. Richard Dawkins was recently in a debate. He got destroyed in this debate, and his opponent, I don't really know the guy who was his opponent, to be honest with you. It's a name I've never heard before, but his opponent, hold on a second, used science to win the debate. But here's the thing that's bad news for atheists, good news for Christians. During the debate, Dawkins conceded that there could be a very good case. He said there is a very strong case for God. A very strong, not weak. He said there is a very strong case for God's existence. Now, a friend of mine sent me this article, and I was reading it, and basically what the article is there was a lady, I believe her name is Melanie something, and she's a reporter for the UK Telegraph. And she went to one of these debates, and she said she never had gone before, but she had heard of Richard Dawkins. And Richard Dawkins, she said, if the article was, is Richard Dawkins still evolving? And it talked about how Richard Dawkins used to say that anyone that believes in God is just as wrong as someone that believes in fairies and Santa and stuff like that, or Father Christmas, as Dawkins says. But now she says that Dawkins is backtracked, he's backpedaled, and he is now admitting that a very strong case for God's existence is there. So now we have, this is very bad news for atheists, we have the #1 most famous atheist in the world saying that there is a very strong case for God's existence. Now, as I bow my head very, very humbly, I want you to know that I've won 25 debates in a row, let's pick up throttle, with atheists versus atheists. Boing, I always hit that bump there. 25 debates in a row. I've challenged Tut the Thunderfoot, the Amazing Atheist, Non-Stamp Collector to a debate. All three are afraid to debate me. They don't want to do it. You know, a lot of them will have videos why I refuse to debate a creationist. Well, that basically means you're never going to debate a Christian then, because Christians believe that God created. Let's cut down the middle here and then we'll come back. So now, what will atheists do now that the number one atheist, most famous atheist in the world, admits that a powerful case for God's existence exists? I got to go to the right here, so leaning. As long as that truck don't get in my way, I'll be okay. So, I want to invite everybody to watch this debate below. Go to shotgunnow.net. You'll see a video of the debate. And it's just amazing how all these atheists are starting to flip-flop and come to God. For example, Christopher Hitchens' brother, Peter Hitchens, was a avid atheist. He now is a on-fire Christian. He has basically turned his back on the fairy tale, the fictional make-believe worldview of atheism. Anthony Flew, who was a very vocal atheist, I believe Dr. William Lane Craig debated him also and won that debate. I know he won that debate, but yeah, it was Craig that debated Anthony Flew. Anthony Flew, before he died, became a theist. He renounced atheism. I myself was an atheist, and thank God I have left the stupidity and madness of atheism. I think as Christians, we should never apologize for saying how stupid and idiotic atheism is. I think it's important that we speak truth as Christians. We love the people that are stuck in the slavery of atheism, but I think it's good and moral and just and right to call the Antichrist worldview of atheism what it is, which is stupidity and madness. Now, we know it's stupidity and madness. Now we have even Richard Dawkins, who used to say that people are deluded to believe in God. Now Richard Dawkins has changed his mind. He now says a good case for God's existence can be made because he's listening to Dr. William Lane Craig, people like Dinesh D'Souza, people like Lee Strobel. These are people that have better arguments for God's existence than Richard Dawkins has for God's non-existence. And it's good to see Richard Dawkins coming around to reality, admitting now that God can exist. Look up that article in the UK Telegraph, and he also says, he doesn't say, well, there might be a slight chance, there might be a slight argument. He says there's a very good argument for God's existence, very strong argument. He uses the word strong. So my atheist friends, what you gonna do? What you gonna do now that you know that atheism is not true? What you gonna do? Oh, I told you guys, why didn't you trust Shock? See, I'm like your uncle, Uncle Shock. You should have trusted me. I told you atheism was madness, my atheist friends. Now you got Richard Dawkins, the number one atheist in the world, flip-flopping, saying, okay, yes, God can exist.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, brother. How you doing, brother? Alhamdulillah, I'm good. Good. We know the purpose of this video is for you to respond to some of the comments made by Richard Dawkins and co, including Professor Myers. The first point I want to raise is with regards to your question to Richard Dawkins at the World Atheist Convention in Dublin, when you asked him about the design of the universe, and he responded with regards to the design of species. What would you like to say about that?
Bismillah. The first thing I would like to say is I would want to thank those atheists who accommodated us in Ireland in that conference. Thank you very much for that. Second point, my question to Dr. Dawkins. My question was pretty straightforward. It was very clear. It was very explicitly stated. And I asked him about the notion of design in the universe. My question was directly about the original universe, not the original species. And Dr. Dawkins misunderstood my question for some strange reason. And having heard my question, he said to me, "How dare you accuse me of believing in chance?" But my question was very simple, because the atheistic position by default is the position of chance. There are only two options in front of us. The universe came about either by chance or by design. And my question was very reasonable in that sense, because Dr. Dawkins is a strong proponent of atheism in the world. This is why I asked him this question. Would he believe in chance, or does he believe in design, as he keeps mentioning in his books? For example, in The Blind Watchmaker, he alludes to an apparent or an illusion of design in the original species or in natural selection. And this is exactly what I meant when I talked about the origin of the universe. My question was not about the species, my question was about the origin of this universe. And he did not address my question.
So clearly he didn't address your question, and he probably just wanted to sidetrack the answer. The reason for that, I don't know if you remember, in the World Atheist Convention, he only said, "Oh, that's a question for physics, and I will give you a very crude understanding of physics." So he didn't really address your question, did he, at all?
Not at all. My question was very explicit. It was clearly stated. I said, "What do you think about the origin of this universe?" And he instead went on to talk about natural selection, which wasn't my question, and then he talked about physics, and he said my answer will be superficial. So he did not give me an answer.
Good. Okay. The next question is with regards to Aristotle and Myers. Not that they share any intellectual similarities, of course.
Right.
But Professor Myers, he was talking to you during the World Atheist Convention, right outside the World Atheist Convention, and he was saying that the embryology in the Quran is similar and borrowed to the Aristotelian view on embryo development. How would you answer this?
Right. I would like to thank Dr. Myers for giving his time to us as well and being very patient with us. I really admire that. However, I don't think Dr. Myers actually answered our questions or some of our contentions. And he raised points which he couldn't substantiate himself. For example, he said Aristotle was a source which gave its embryology to the Quran. Then the Quran borrowed from Aristotle. Quran did not borrow from Aristotle. And we asked this question directly to Dr. Myers, "Can you give us any evidence?" And he failed to give us any conclusive evidence in this regard. So even Dr. Dawkins actually picked up on this, and on his website, richarddawkins.net, he wrote a small piece on this particular interaction we had with Dr. Myers, and he titled it, "Islamic Board Talks Over P.Z. Myers." And he goes on to talk about our interaction, and he states how impatient he would have been if he was in the place of Dr. Myers, and he would have walked away 5 minutes later, but Dr. Myers had a lot of patience with people like us.
Okay, but the thing is, with regards to Richard Dawkins, what he's written, or someone has written on his website, he actually talks about Noah's flood and calls you a liar.
No,
he said that you are rejecting Noah's flood because someone brought it up with regards to the biblical narrative, and he said that never happened scientifically, therefore the Quran is also wrong because it mentions the same thing. And you said no, the Quran doesn't. Please clarify.
Okay, he's referring to the interaction I had with a gentleman called Aaron Ra. Aaron Ra mentioned the notion of evolution, and I told him that evolution is not to be found in the Quran. Then he talked about the great flood. Aaron Ra did not mention Noah's Ark, as Richard Dawkins seems to be thinking. I think Dr. Dawkins needs to go back and watch the video again carefully, because he seems to be thinking that there was a discussion about Noah's Ark. Aaron Ra did not mention Noah's Ark, rather he mentioned the great flood. And I responded to him by saying there is no great flood in the Quran, which is exactly what the case is. Now, what does the Quran say? Quran talks about a flood. There is a flood of Noah in the Quran, but it is a local flood. When we talk about the great flood, it is a loaded term. That means the biblical great global flood. Quran doesn't talk about a biblical great global flood. Quran talks about a local Noah's flood. So I was right in that case, and Dr. Dawkins has grossly misunderstood what I said to Aaron Ra. In fact, Dr. Dawkins calls me a liar, and unfortunately, he states, but I think he was wrong to climb down. He's talking about Aaron Ra climbing down from not confronting me. And he states, the story of Noah's ark is in the Quran exactly as he said. The Muslim was lying, as faith heads so often do, presumably again in an attempt to wrong foot. So, Dr. Dawkins, in fact, was mistaken. I wasn't lying. I was speaking the truth. There is no great flood in the Quran, and it is very clear. Then another point I wanted to address was the issue of thumma. When Dr. Myers contested our point about the stages of embryology in the Quran, and he said that if the Quran states that flesh comes after the bones, then the Quran is wrong. This is exactly what Dr. Keith Moore said, that flesh comes after the bones. And he contested the point of Dr. Keith Moore. But I asked him to tell us what the right view on embryology is, and he said that he's an embryologist, and both the bones and the flesh form simultaneously. I told him, if that's the case, the Quran can be reconciled with that fact, if it's a fact, that the word thumma can be used to describe things happening simultaneously, or things happening one after the other immediately. Immediate things happening. This can be seen in Lane's lexicon. If you go to one of the best dictionaries of Arabic language, Arabic and English, Lane's lexicon, if you go to the term thumma in this dictionary, you will see that thumma can be used in these two different ways, as I described in the video. So I was correct in this regard.
Okay, good. Thank you very much, Aman, for that. Let me ask you a question, Jeremy, about your whole experience at the World Atheist Convention. Give me some thoughts about your interaction in Dublin.
Well, we had some interesting interactions, especially on the last day. We met some atheists and we told them how we felt about the convention. We had mixed feelings about different people behaving in different ways. For example, some people were very aggressive. They insulted us, they abused us, they laughed at us. Sometimes we would ask valid questions and we would get laughs in return. And other people were quite appreciative. They were quite accommodating. And we met some nice people. We had some constructive discussions. In fact, a couple of people I spoke to on the last day, I told them that I'm actually walking away with a stronger faith in Islam, not the other way around. This convention and listening to all of these top atheists in the world hasn't changed my views on Islam. Rather, in fact, my faith has been strengthened by listening to these people. Because some of the points they were raising were emotional. Some of the things they were talking about were superficial. For example, Maryam Namazi, she talked about Sharia law in a very superficial way. Unfortunately, her treatment was quite vicious and very, very biased. And she had a standing ovation, which was quite disturbing.
Well, she did have a lot of outdated cliches. What was worrying for me is that during the convention, you had a lot of atheists making claims about the Quran and Islamic law that were actually not true, which shows to me that people pick their attitudes and their perceptions to religion, and specifically Islam and Islamic law, via media narrative, via an atheist narrative, which is a joke. For instance, they say that women have no rights because if they get raped, they need 4 male witnesses. Now, can you please address this issue, Adnan?
Well, this is a very commonly fostered notion about the Sharia law that women, if they are raped, they need 4 witnesses to prove that they were raped. This is obnoxious. This doesn't exist in the Sharia. This rule or this notion is non-existent in the entire Sharia law. It's not there, it's not present. So we're asking the atheists to produce the evidence. We don't want to see the Constitution of Pakistan. Constitution of Pakistan is the Sharia law. Sharia law is the Quran, the prophetic tradition, and the ijma', the consensus of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ. So if they can prove something, if they can provide something for us to see from the Sharia law, which states that a woman needs 4 witnesses to prove that she was raped, then we will accept it. There is none. There is nothing.
So what does the Sharia actually say with regards to rape?
Sharia states if a woman is raped and she complains of rape and she comes to the qadi or to the judge and she files a complaint, any evidence will be accepted. Any evidence to prove rape will be, any evidence which is accepted in the UK and in America.
For instance, her testimony and DNA.
Her testimony, DNA, witnesses, anything which will prove.
Okay, so what kind of category of criminal punishment does it come under in the Sharia law?
It comes under the Hiraba Code, which is Highway Robbery Code, forceful criminal act, and it's very simple.
And what are the punishments for someone who gets caught for rape?
The punishments are very, very severe.
Which is in contrast...
To put it in simple terms, punishment is death penalty in Islam for rape.
So, essentially, this is in contrast to the secular liberal narrative where some rapists get only 1 or 2 years.
And they come out and re-offend.
Yeah.
Well, you're right. So, in this case, Islam is quite reasonable, and this is why we ask our atheists friends to go and study more about Islam.
Okay, thank you very much, Adnan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
All right, folks, what I'm about to read you is going to shock you. Richard Dawkins is now saying there could be a deistic God. Check this out. A serious case could be made for a deistic God. Richard Dawkins is now admitting that God can exist. I told you, atheist, I told you. Christian theism is making large segues. Check this out. It says on Tuesday evening, this person right here with the Melanie Phillips with the Spectator, very reputable newspaper, she says that, I believe Melanie is a woman, she attended the debate between Richard Dawkins and John Lennox at Oxford's Natural History Museum. Watch this. This is going to blow your mind. It said, Lennox is the Oxford mathematics professor whose book, God's Undertaker and Has Science Buried God, is to my mind an excoriating demolition of Dawkins' overreach from biology into religion, as expressed in his book, The God Delusion. All the more devastating because Lennox attacks Dawkins on the basis of science itself. As we know, Christian theism is smack dab perfectly situated into real science. It is atheism whose modern science has now put its back against the wall. Atheism has its back against the wall. The witness to this debate says, in the first debate, which can be seen on video on this website, Dawkins was badly caught off balance by Lennox's argument precisely because possibly for the first time Dawkins was being challenged on his own chosen scientific ground. Dawkins got destroyed in this debate. Dawkins conceded that God can exist. It says, this week's debate, however, was different because from the off, Dawkins moved into safer territory and at the very beginning made a most startling admission. Here it is, my Christian brothers and sisters. Dawkins admits it. A serious case could be made for a deistic God. It's over, atheist. It is over. The article goes on to say, this was surely remarkable. Of course it's remarkable. Dawkins saying that not just a case, a serious case can now be made for the deistic God. He's admitting God can't exist. Richard Dawkins, the atheist, admits God can't exist. The article says, here was the arch-apostle of atheism. The arch-apostle of atheism, whose whole case is based on the assertion that believing in a creator of the universe is no different from believing in fairies at the bottom of the garden. Now he says that a serious case can be made that the idea that the universe was brought into by some kind of purposeful force, a creator. Look at that. There it is. a creator. There you have it, atheist. This is a huge win for Christian theism. Richard Dawkins is now admitting that God can exist. Now, I strongly suggest you click below this video you are now watching and look at some more proof and evidence that atheism is not true. Even now, Dawkins is moving away from atheism. I guarantee you, before Dawkins reaches his older years, he's probably going to become a deist, a theist, just like Anthony Flew the atheist did. Dawkins now admits that a serious case could be made for a deistic God. It's over, atheism. Game over.
One, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Two, the universe began to exist. Three, therefore, the universe has a cause.
And I'm very happy to be debating Dr. Craig, the one Christian apologist who seems to put the fear of God into many of my fellow atheists.
Look at what Dr. Craig says in his book.
As a professional philosopher, I'm convinced that there are better arguments for theism than for atheism.
A stunning amount of careful articulation, structure of some dauntingly difficult issues.
Think about that.
That's philosophical bunkum. The cause hasn't got to be God. I think it's a computer, a special computer.
What you're calling a computer is really God. A non-physical,
It seems to me a very not a small question.
No, it's certainly not a small question.
How can you be a Christian? How can you be a Jew? How can you be a Muslim?
Not only is it unscientific, it doesn't do justice to the grandeur of the universe. It's petty and small-minded.
Dr. Craig, you've debated the top atheist thinkers in the world on university campuses and at other events. What about a debate with Dawkins?
The ultimate 747 gambit is a very serious argument against the existence of God.
It is a patently logically invalid argument.
And one to which I have yet to hear a theologian give a convincing answer, despite numerous opportunities and invitations to do so. Numerous opportunities and invitations to do so.
He has resolutely refused to debate.
Have you ever thought about having a debate with Richard Dawkins?
He said, I wouldn't debate a religious person unless he were at least a bishop. And since Craig isn't a bishop...
I would like to hear what's wrong with the arguments that I put forward. Nobody has actually said what's wrong with it. I have always said when invited to do debates that I will be happy to debate a bishop, a cardinal, a pope, an archbishop, but that I don't take on creationists.
How old is the world?
13.7 billion years.
And I don't take on people whose only claim to fame is that they are professional debaters. They've got to have something more than that.
The letter that Dawkins sent back said, I don't know who William Lane Craig is, and while a debate with Craig might look good on Craig's resume, it wouldn't look good on mine.
He won't debate perhaps the most armed example of Christian apologetics, if we can put it like that.
Well, I think it would be a very good dialogue. I have written published critiques of his arguments in the God delusion, and so far as I know, he's not cared to respond to these either, even in print.
Second problem with Dawkins' objections.
They've got to have something more than that. I'm busy.
Sorry.
I'm busy.
We have not managed to pull that one off.
Now, Mr. Craig...
Professor.
Mr. Craig was critical of me
he suddenly says to me, oh, by the way, Michio Kaku decided not to participate in the debate, so Richard Dawkins is going to be in his place.
Can we assume that he wasn't aware that you were involved?
I don't think we can assume that, but of course that was the question that I wondered about. Did they even tell him?
In today's debate, we've been asked to discuss not whether God exists, but whether the universe has a purpose.
William Lane Craig seemed to think that it would be so intolerable, so disagreeable.
If God does not exist, then the universe has no purpose.
Going to come to an end. It's not nice to think that everything is meaningless.
None of this proves that God exists.
And therefore, somehow that must prove that there is purpose in the universe. There is.
I'm only hearing straw men.
God.
Let me simply list the arguments which I have defended in my published work.
There is not a shred of evidence.
David,
Suppose the universe is so finely tuned.
The why question is just as silly, pathetic, silly, lazy.
Time out, I'm sorry.
These are the deepest existential questions that human beings can ask.
Maybe it will lead to further exchanges where you'll have a little more time to develop the case.
Well, I hope it will. If you're interested in a detailed discussion of these arguments...
Time is out, I'm sorry.
I suppose you'd still like to meet Richard Dawkins, as it were, in a one-to-one encounter. Would that still be something?
Oh, very much. He's offered a lengthy critique of theism in his book, The God Delusion. I have responded to those arguments in published work. I'm convinced that they're worthless, and I would very much like to have a public discussion with him about these issues.
They've got nothing really to stand up for. They've got nothing. They've got no decent arguments, so they have to take offense. It's the only weapon they've got.
I've been given all I wanted. Only 3 generations.
We have a UK speaking tour which is being planned for October of 2011.
That may pass for an argument in Talbot Theological College. It may indeed pass for an argument in the White House. But this is Cambridge, and it doesn't pass for an argument here.
It is the beginning point of time. Listen to what they write on pages 134.
People who value the power of the human intellect should ensure that our children are not contaminated by this abomination.
So I suspect what he would have to say is, well, I wasn't trying to be a philosopher here. This is a popular level book. I could tighten up the argument if I wanted to. And then I think we have to simply invite him to do so. Folks have been trying to arrange a debate between me and Richard Dawkins on the existence of God for a number of years, and Dawkins has consistently refused. Most recently, he turned down the offer again.
It's not every day that one atheist accuses another of cowardice for refusing to debate a Christian. It's even rarer when both are Oxford dons. Richard Dawkins, the world's most famous atheist, is facing that accusation because he has turned down an offer to publicly debate a man regarded by many as the world's leading defender of Christian belief. That has prompted some people, including an atheist philosopher at Oxford University, Daniel Kame, to accuse Richard Dawkins of cowardice in refusing to debate.
I don't care who you are, what community you come from, or what church you go to, or anything else. I want to talk to you, have a dialogue with you about the evidence one way or the other. We'll have a friendly conversation about it, and I'll win the argument.
What they plan to do at the Sheldonian Theatre in Oxford is set up the stage for a debate format with an empty table, an empty chair, where Dawkins will be given the opportunity to the last minute to show up and join in the debate. But if he doesn't, then I'll simply give a lecture criticizing his arguments in the God delusion against the existence of God.
I've had over the years a number of political discussions, which is typically the topic of my programs, other than this segment, and had objectivists in particular, people who are followers of Ayn Rand, actually quote you and suggest that your selfish gene metaphor and the economics of Milton Friedman or Friedrich von Hayek and the modern libertarian movement are the same thing, and that your selfish gene movement or your selfish gene hypothesis assertion, how you'll have to fill in the word. I'm sorry, I don't have the correct word. Informs that, not informs that movement, but demonstrates the validity of individual selfishness. I'm curious how you would respond to those people. I'm sure you've heard
I would disavow and disown that. One of the most surprising things that happened after The Selfish Gene was published was that I started getting letters from right-wing libertarians in America. I'd never even met a right-wing libertarian, but they started writing to me. And it's a total misunderstanding. As I said before, genes are selfish, and that's nothing to do with whether individuals are selfish, or rather it's a very complicated relationship. And in particular, it says nothing whatever about the moral rightness or wrongness of being selfish. You can take a stand on that, which is based upon something quite different from my stand on evolutionary biology. There's no reason why somebody shouldn't read The Selfish Gene and, as it happens, be a right-wing libertarian, but absolutely there's no reason why they should read The Selfish Gene and therefore become a right-wing libertarian. I have always voted on the left in British elections.
If our genes are controlling our behavior, and many people have had experiences that they would describe as deeply spiritual, and thus maybe draw them to religion, why would such a gene echo down through the generations?
Well, it's a difficult thing to say that genes control us. We are very much influenced by our education, by our environment. So I'm not sure that I would want to ask that in a sort of genetic way. It's probably true, as we said earlier on in our conversation. I mean, genes do influence brains, and brains are what decide whether you're going to be religious or not. And so there might be a genetic component in whether you are, in whether you tend to be drawn to religion. Now, you mentioned the word spiritual, and that's a much misused word, because people often use spiritual to mean the kind of thing that I mean by the magic of reality. The kind of thing I mean by looking up at the stars and being filled with wonder, being filled with joy at seeing the stupendous sight of the universe, or looking down a microscope, or thinking, or going to the Grand Canyon and looking down through the layers of geological time. I mean, that's magical in the sense of the magic of reality, and you could even call that spiritual. But I rather resent the hijacking of that. Call it spiritual if you like, I prefer not to. I rather resent the hijacking of that feeling, which I feel, and which any of my scientist friends feel, hijacking by religion. It is not a monopoly of religion. We all feel it, or we all are capable of feeling it.
This is the human condition. Very well said. In the God delusion, you're asserting that a supernatural creator doesn't exist, and that belief in a personal God qualifies as a delusion. Do you also make that argument for the belief in any sort of consciousness beyond the individual? For example, could it be that the universe itself is a conscious organism and we're one expression of it within it? Or for that matter, what is consciousness?
Well, I don't know what consciousness is, and it's a very difficult philosophical question. I don't think it's probably going to be helpful to talk about the universe as a whole being conscious. I know that some rather mystical philosophers have suggested something like that. I think that whatever consciousness is, it's manifested by brains. It's something to do with brains, or the functional equivalent of brains. I mean, I wouldn't rule out that one day somebody might build an electronic computer which was programmed in such a way that it was conscious. That seems to me to be actually quite likely. But it comes from very, very complex organization, such as the brain, which is an extremely complicated organization of billions of neurons. And if anybody makes a computer that's conscious, that again will be extremely complicated with many, many, many units, electronic units. So no, I don't think it's helpful to think that consciousness resides in the universe as a whole. I think consciousness is something that emerges by the evolutionary process in the universe, wherever in the universe brains, or something functionally equivalent to brains, evolve.
Do you think it's conceivable that as the internet and the number of computers connected to it begins to approach numbers that are similar to the number of axons and ganglions and synapses in the brain, that the internet itself may, you said consciousness emerges from it, that consciousness may emerge from the internet?
That is a fascinating science fiction speculation, and before we laugh it away, we should remember that that's pretty much what did happen in the evolution of brains, because brains started off as very simple nervous systems, and then the simple nervous systems got bigger and bigger and bigger, more and more interconnected in complicated ways, and that is what's happening to the internet. And so I wouldn't absolutely rule out the possibility that sometime in the future something like the internet, probably very different from the way the internet is now, but something like the internet, a global network of electronic connections between computing devices all over the world, might develop something like the same properties as the brain evolved millions of years ago.
Chapter 2. Who was the first person? Like most chapters in the book, it's headed by a few myths, and in this case I've got a Tasmanian Aboriginal myth, and a Norse myth, a Valhalla myth of the origin of the first person. All cultures have had origin myths, all cultures have had creation myths, and I've just chosen 3 of them. The third one I chose was the Jewish myth of Genesis, the myth of Adam and Eve. I toss in the Judeo-Christian myth along with the others. There's nothing special about it, it's just a myth like any other. And then we come to the meat of the chapter. Who was the first person really? There never was a first person. Because every person had to have parents, and those parents had to be people too. And they had to have parents, and they were people too. There never was a first rabbit, never a first crocodile, never a first dragonfly. Every creature ever born belonged to the same species as its parents. They belonged to the same species as its grandparents, and so on. And its great-great-grandparents, and its great-great-great-great-grandparents, and so on, forever. Forever? No. It's not as simple as that. That's going to need a bit of explaining. A thought experiment. A thought experiment in your imagination. What we're going to imagine is not literally possible because we're going to go way, way, way back in time, long before you were born. Take a picture of yourself, say a photograph of yourself, put it on the table. Lay on top of it a photograph of your father. Lay on top of that a photograph of his father, and his father, and his father, and so on, for a very, very large number of generations. A very, very large number of great-great-great-great-grandparents. How many greats do we need for our thought experiment? I should think about 185 million would do. It's not easy to imagine a pile of 185 million pictures. It would be about 220,000 feet high. That's more than 180 New York skyscrapers standing on top of each other. So we're going to tilt it on its side, put it in a bookshelf, running 40 miles. The near end of the bookshelf is a picture of you, next to it is a picture of your father, next his father, next his father, and at the far end of the row of pictures is your 185 million greats grandfather. What did he look like? An old man with wispy hair and white side whiskers? A caveman in a leopard skin? Nothing like that. That's your 185 million great A fish. He was a fish. So was your 185 million great grandmother. Or they wouldn't have got on. There's an element of paradox, but it's not a very profound paradox in my statement that every species ever born, every individual ever born, belonged to the same species as its parents, and yet if you go back through enough generations, starting with a human, you'll come to a fish. It's not that paradoxical because, after all, we're very used to the idea of things changing gradually. We were all once babies, then we became toddlers, and then we became children, and then we became teenagers. But there was never a moment when a baby went to bed at night and woke up as a toddler, and never a moment when a toddler went to bed and woke up as a child. These things happen gradually, and you notice only after a while, it looks as though he's growing up, doesn't it? There are sort of arbitrary points, like the 18th birthday, when by law we say we have reached adulthood, but everybody knows that nothing special happens on your 18th birthday. Let's go back along our row of postcards of photographs, pick out a few. There you can see your 4,000 great-grandfather, who was pretty much the same as us. Your 50,000 great-grandfather would have been a member of a different species, Homo erectus. But, to repeat my point, there never was a moment when a Homo sapiens baby was born to Homo erectus parents. It all happened much too gradually. You notice the change if you walk sufficiently far along the road of postcards. Or you notice the change if you travel sufficiently far into the past, what that means. But you don't notice the change if you just look at each generation one at a time. Your 250,000 great-grandfather, 6 million years ago, would have looked something like a chimpanzee, and it would have been the common ancestor of ourselves and chimpanzees. It would have been no more closely related to a modern chimpanzee than it is related to us. It was the common ancestor. It probably looked a bit more like a chimpanzee, which means that that lineage has changed a bit less than ours. Walking further along the shelf of pictures, we come to 25 million years ago, and your 1.5 million great-grandfather, who would have been perhaps something like a monkey. Your 7 million great-grandfather, 63 million years ago, might have looked a bit like a bush baby or a lemur, and would have been the common ancestor of modern bush babies and lemurs, and of modern humans and apes and monkeys, and would have been no more closely related to modern bush babies and lemurs than to us, though it might have looked more like them. Your 45 million great-grandfather, 105 million years ago, something like a shrew or a tree shrew. Your 170 million great-grandmother, 310 million years ago, the ancestor of all reptiles and of all mammals and birds. It's been drawn as sort of a bit like a lizard, but we don't know whether it was really like that. Your 175 million great-grandfather, 340 million years ago, the common ancestor of modern salamanders, it looks a bit like a salamander, and frogs, and of us. And then, this is where we came in, 417 million years ago, your 185 million great-grandfather, that fish. And of course we don't stop there. The line of picture postcards wends its way on and on into the past. And at some point we start to run out of fossils and they become less and less clear what our ancestors looked like, but it's fairly clear that they would have eventually been single-celled animals, single-celled creatures, more like bacteria perhaps. Now I'm going to skip to chapter 5, which is why do we have night and day, and why do we have winter and summer? Nobody has much trouble with night and day, if you know it's because the Earth spins on its axis. Winter and summer, there is a certain amount of problem here. You'd be surprised at the number of people who think that winter is when the Earth is furthest from the sun, and summer is when the Earth is closest to the sun. I was told this story by an Australian. There was a science fiction story in which there were travellers from Earth voyaging away from our solar system towards some distant star system. and they were waxing nostalgic for home. And one of them said to the other, "Just to think that it's summertime back on Earth." Now remember, it was an Australian who told me that story. You'll get it eventually. The truth, of course, is that winter and summer is nothing to do with how close the Earth is to the Sun. The Earth's orbit is almost circular, it's not quite circular. I believe that at present we are closest to the Sun in January. And the real reason for winter and summer is the tilt of the Earth's axis. But in the course of this chapter, I wanted to explain what it means for something to be in orbit around anything. And this is a good opportunity for me to introduce the app, which goes with it.
Is it okay to ask questions about anything? Not even limited to the book necessarily?
Within reason.
Of course. I wrote mine down so I don't pass out. Basic evolution says that particular adaptations are likely to pass when given the advantage of longer life due to more opportunity to reproduce for a species. I have made up my own amateur theories, but seeing as I respect you so much, I was wondering how is it, in your opinion, that death-related adaptations are passed on, specifically the surge of happy chemicals, so to speak, that put animals in a state of relaxation as they die?
Well, that's an interesting question. It's one that I had never thought of before. If it's true that there is a surge of happy chemicals that puts animals into a happy state when they die, I presume you mean something like a gazelle, the moment when the lion's jaws close on it, has a happy surge. Is that what you mean?
No. I mean, like, even in human beings, people say in near-death experiences, they get these exhilarating feelings, and chemicals like dopamine rush to the brain.
Well, I must say I look forward to that. I'm not sure how general that phenomenon is. It would be very nice to think that it was. I think you're right to be at least momentarily skeptical that one could come up with a Darwinian explanation for it. I suspect that it probably doesn't have one. If it's a real phenomenon, it's probably a byproduct of something else. I wouldn't go searching too assiduously for a Darwinian explanation for that phenomenon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, it's an honor.
Hi, Dr. Dawkins. This is Troy Boyle. I'm the president of the National Atheist Party. And one of the things that I find happening in debates on Facebook and online and anywhere else that theists and atheists come to loggerheads is one that I like to typify by saying that it seems at the end of all debate that the theist is happier with what they consider to be their emotional truth rather than an objective or scientific standard for truth. And I'm curious how you would address that dichotomy.
I've noticed something similar. You will sometimes hear people say, "Oh, well, in my life quest, I tried Buddhism, but that didn't seem quite right for me, and then so I thought I'd try Christianity. And, well, Christianity was all right, but I didn't find it all that consoling. And then I tried Judaism, and it's as though what they're seeking is what makes them feel good, rather than what's true. And I can't get my head around that. I mean, it seems to me that the fundamental propositions of religions are existence propositions. They're propositions about the way things are. Either there is a God or there isn't. Either Jesus is the Son of God or he wasn't. Either Muhammad was a holy prophet or he wasn't. And so whether people's feelings are tickled by a particular religion, whether they feel happy because of their belief in God, is absolutely irrelevant to the question of whether God is true. And I cannot bring myself to overcome my desire to know what's true in order to just be cheerful. I think it might have been Bertrand Russell who told the story of a woman who wrote to him and said, no, it wasn't Bertrand Russell, I beg your pardon, it was somebody else. She said, I accept the universe. And he said, by gad, she'd better.
Thank you, sir. I also want to point out that I prefer the magic of reality, too.
Thank you.
Hey, Dr. Dawkins, I appreciate you being here today. So, I guess when you were talking about there was never really a first human being, I was following your points, but I also kind of brought up questions of identity for me. If there was no, it's kind of a three-part question, so hang with me. If there was no first person, what am I? How do we judge the innate value of a human if each person is, quote-unquote, more advanced than the previous generation? And does this, how should we interpret this with races?
What an excellent question. Yes, absolutely. What it means is that there was no first person, and you are wrong to even try to draw a line around the species Homo sapiens and to say that there is a unique humanness which separates humanity from all other species. If you think about it, the very idea of there being a separation between humanity and all other species is deeply unevolutionary. It's rather like trying to judge the moment when an embryo becomes human, the moment of conception or 3 weeks after conception or whatever it is. It's a nonsensical question. And it's even more nonsensical in the evolutionary sphere, because it really is true that there never was a sudden moment when in the generation of our ancestors you could say, right, these parents were not human, this child is human. It never happened. Now the reason why it's possible for us to construct a system of law, a system of morality, which is species-based, which singles out humanity for unique treatment and treats all other species differently, the reason why we can get away with that is the accident of history that the intermediates happen to be extinct. If the intermediates were still around, and imagine as a thought experiment that somewhere in the African jungle, explorers discover a whole series of intermediates between humans and chimpanzees, so close to each other that it's possible to interbreed with them in a continuous daisy chain all the way from us to chimpanzees. Thus I can mate with A, who can mate with B, who can mate with C, who can mate with D, who can mate with a chimpanzee and produce fertile offspring all the way. Now, that has got to be, in principle, possible if only the intermediates hadn't happened to go extinct. If we could only reach out in a time machine and bring those intermediates back to life, then it would be possible to construct such a daisy chain of interbreeding, fertile interbreeding, all the way between us and chimpanzees, and which would mean that the only way to come to a point about race, it means that the only way to accept our species' law and ethics would be to have ludicrous courts of law, rather like they did in South Africa, where they had courts of law to decide whether people were black or counted as white. You would have to have courts of law to decide whether such and such an individual counts as human. So our human-centered ethics, our human-centered morality, which pervades almost all of religious morality that I'm aware of, is entirely based upon the accidental fact that the intermediates in evolution happen to be dead and extinct.
Thank you.
is to purposefully try to locate intelligent life elsewhere. Do you agree? Why or why not?
Well, no, because what he's worried about is that it will call attention of extraterrestrial beings to our existence, and they might come and eat us or something. But in order for that to happen, they would have to be close enough to reach us. And I made the point earlier that the speed with which bodies can physically move is so much slower than the speed with which radio signals can move, that I think we're probably pretty safe to allow evidence of our existence to radiate outwards. And I think also it's probably worth the money, by the way, to be doing the opposite, SETI, listening with parabolic dishes, listening for signals from elsewhere.
Good evening, Dr. Dawkins, audience. As Christopher Hitchens likes to say, if you would kind enough to permit me to clear my throat for a few seconds here. As it's not every night, Richard Dawkins is in Richmond, Kentucky. Woo! Benjamin Franklin once advised, write something worth reading or do something worth being written about. It must be very satisfying then to now have accomplished both. After giving Darwin a second wind and Hamilton's idea of wings to fly, you spearhead the movement to raise the consciousness of the world. You're nothing if not ambitious. The Jefferson said, enlighten the people generally, enlighten the people generally, and tyranny and oppression of body and mind will vanish. I do have a question. And indeed, sir, in my own life, the change in my youth of fear, guilt, shame, with their imaginary flowers have been broken, that I may now embrace the living flower. To borrow from Thoreau, I built my castle in the sky. Its name was cognitive dissonance, but without the persistent efforts of yourself and others like you, building that foundation for it, I might never have moved in. You have my profound gratitude. My question is, generations from now, when perhaps some of us in attendance are going through the history of scientific thought with our grandchildren, just in case, as Kipling put it, the truth you've spoken gets twisted by knaves to make a trap for fools, what specifically should we tell them was the great hope and intention of Richard Dawkins on the night that we all had the great pleasure of attending his lecture in Richmond, Kentucky? Thank you.
Goodness, right. I think on the spur of the moment, not having had time to prepare as thoroughly as you have with your question, I would say that I would look forward to a time when all children are brought up to think for themselves, are taught to believe things only when they hear evidence for it, and are taught to mistrust authority, tradition, revelation, faith, and just rejoice in being in the real world and rejoice in having a brain which is capable of apprehending the real world, not just with our senses, but with all the faculties of scientific thought, so that they will grow up having as full an appreciation as possible of the universe into which they happen to have been born and of the history of events that led them to be here, because that is a wonderful state to be in. It's a state that can be reached, and in the 21st century already we are in a very good position to reach it, but unfortunately it's denied to a very large number of people. And this is a good opportunity for me to introduce the app which goes with it.
There's got to be an answer.
There is an app called Magic of Reality, which contains all the text of the book and all the pictures by Dave McKean in the book. But it also, in every chapter, it has a simulation, a game, an animation. And I want to demonstrate one of those. unplug it, I'm afraid, to plug in the iPad. I'm sorry, it only runs on the iPad. Isaac Newton, who more than anybody else worked out the principles of orbiting bodies, asked us to picture a cannon which would fire cannonballs at increasing velocity. And I'm going to try to do this. I placed my cannon on the top of the world in the North Pole, and there's a sort of pea shooter sticking out of the back of the cannon, which enables you to fire the cannon, and you control the velocity by pulling the pea shooter back different distances. And you can steer the up and down of the cannon as well. I'm going to try to do it, although I'm not very apt, is that the right word? That splashed into the sea. I'll get as far as a bit faster. And that went into outer space. It tried to curl round and was about to go into orbit, but didn't quite make it and went off and reached escape velocity. There we go. And while I've got the app plugged in, I might as well demonstrate a bit more from it. You see the text and the pictures flow through. And what's that? That's another. Yes, you can have. Yes, that's showing the why there's winter and summer. But the spotlight's a bit fierce on the screen, so it's a bit harder to see. But you can tell that it's the side that's tilted towards the sun, of course, it has sun. Across the top here we have the chapters. I'll go to what is a rainbow chapter. And then here we have the various pages of the chapter concerned, beginning with the myths as usual. Yes, there's a familiar myth. That, as of course you know, comes from the Epic of Gilgamesh. A man called Utnapishtim was warned by the gods that there was a great flood coming. And the gods told Utnapishtim to build a great boat and to take 2 of every animal on board the boat to save all of life. And at the end, when the flood went down, the gods placed a rainbow in the sky to guarantee that there never would be another major flood like that again. Okay, I'm going to leave the app now and go back to it. I'm now going to skip to chapter 9, which is called Are We Alone? This is a slightly unusual chapter because it's much more speculative than the others. Most of the other chapters contain quite a lot of what we already know. Of course, it's important that in science there's a lot that we don't know. And one of the main things we don't know is whether we are alone in the universe. It's a very interesting question. Most people are fascinated by it. Carl Sagan was once asked whether he believed that there is life on other planets elsewhere in the universe. And he said, I don't know, which is the right answer. But his questioner then pressed him and said, but what is your gut feeling? And Carl Sagan immortally replied, but I try not to think with my gut. We can only guess, and our guesses don't have to be completely lacking in science to inform our guesses by making calculations about the various things we might need to know in order to roughly estimate the likelihood that there is life elsewhere. This chapter is also unusual in that there don't seem to be any ancient myths about extraterrestrial life, probably because in ancient times the very concept of extraterrestrial wasn't around. It was thought that terrestrial was it, this was it. And there were stars going around, but nobody really thought that the stars might be extremely numerous, extremely distant, and extremely large, and might have planets of their own. So for this chapter, in my myth section, I had to turn to modern myths. About 4% of the American people seem to believe that they have personally been abducted by aliens on flying saucers, and in some cases subjected to the most undignified sexual experiments. Actually, visitation by physical bodies is enormously less likely than visitation by radio waves. If we ever do discover life elsewhere in the universe, it is highly unlikely to be actual physical bodies visiting us. It's much, much more likely to be radio transmissions, for the simple reason that radio transmissions go at the speed of light and radiate outwards in all directions, whereas physical bodies, unless they're very, very advanced, don't go anywhere near the speed of light and don't radiate out in all directions, that's for sure. So let's come to the question, is there really life on other planets? And as I said, we don't know, but we can sort of write down what we would need to know in order to make some rough calculations. And one of the things we would need to know is how many stars there are and how likely it is that they have planets. Well, the number of stars is simply prodigious. The next slide shows a simulation of a rocket, let's say, retreating away from the sun. So there's the sun, and now we're retreating away from it. And it's now invisible, it's become too small to see. We're going further and further and further away from our home. And now we see the Milky Way galaxy. And then we see other neighboring galaxies. Now those are all galaxies, those things that we see retreating. A reasonable estimate of the number of stars in the universe is about 10 to the 22. Until recently, we didn't know whether any of those other stars have planets. It was only a sort of guess that it was unlikely that our sun would be that unusual to be the only one that had planets. It has recently become possible to detect that other stars actually do have planets, and by a rather interesting way. You can't actually see them directly, or it's very difficult to see them directly, because they're too small and they're too dim, because they only shine by reflected light from their star, rather than emitting light like the star itself. So the indirect way in which planets are detected is by the effect that they have on the movement of the star. When we say that a planet orbits its star, when we say that Jupiter, say, orbits the sun, that makes sense because we think of the sun as being in the middle and Jupiter going round and round. But actually, the larger the planet is, the more is the tendency for the two to orbit each other. And there are binary stars which are approximately the same size as each other, and they go round and round like a pair of dumbbells. Well, Jupiter's not big enough for that. But when Jupiter orbits the sun makes small token movements, as though sort of making a little apology for an orbit of Jupiter. We can't easily see those movements either, but what astronomers can do is measure the Doppler shift in the colour spectrum of the light that's coming from the star. So when the star is moving away from us, its spectrum is shifted in the red direction. And when it's moving towards us, its spectrum is shifted in the blue direction. So if we look at the spectrum of a star, and we see that it shifts red, blue, red, blue, red, blue, with a periodicity of, say, some months, then we can infer that there is something orbiting that star with that periodicity. And it's that method that is responsible for most of what we know about extrasolar planets. And it's starting to look as though the majority of stars do have planets in orbit around them, which means that that figure I put up there is probably an underestimate for the number of planets. But of course, that doesn't mean they're suitable for life. It may be that suitability for life is extremely rare. One point that's been made is life, as we know it, depends upon liquid water. And astronomers or exobiologists talk about a so-called Goldilocks zone around a star. Goldilocks zone being just right, not too hot, not too cold, but just right, like baby bear's porridge. So there I've drawn, or Dave McKean has drawn, the green Goldilocks zone, and Earth is in the Goldilocks zone for our sun. And then there are planets that are inside the Goldilocks zone, too hot, planets that are outside the Goldilocks zone, too cold. So that's going to reduce our 10 to the 22 very substantially. There will only be a minority of planets that are in the Goldilocks zone with respect to water. And, of course, we don't know that extraterrestrial life depends on liquid water. It may be so alien that it depends upon something quite different, like ammonia. But if it's anything like our life, it needs to be in the Goldilocks zone for liquid water. Maybe there are other Goldilocks zones. Maybe for gravity. A planet which is extremely heavy, extremely massive, will have a very strong gravitational field, and that will put constraints on the kind of life that you can expect to find there. Dave McKean has fancifully drawn a mouse-sized animal which is built sort of a bit like a rhinoceros, with great big tree stump limbs, on a planet with a very large gravitational field, and on the right, a rhinoceros-like animal on a very light planet, which skitters around like a long-legged spider. So there may be lots of different Goldilocks zones. The number of suitable planets may be rather low, but nevertheless the total number of planets is so great that we still have to contend with the very large number of available places where life could have evolved. And that leads me to the final thought that I want to have on this topic of are we alone? If you want to say, if you have a gut feeling that we are alone, if you think it's very unlikely that there is life anywhere else in the universe, then one thing that may not have occurred to you follows logically from the enormous number of planets that there are available. The origin of life, which may only have happened once, only needed to happen once on this planet, is a difficult topic which chemists are working on, trying to discover, trying to work out models for how life originated on this planet. And so far they haven't succeeded. If you are committed to the view that we are alone in the universe, then the origin of life on this planet, on any planet, must have been a quite stupefyingly rare and improbable event. So rare and improbable that we could go to these chemists in their labs trying to work out what might have happened in the origin of life and say, you are totally wasting your time. Because what we're looking for in our theory of the origin of life is not a plausible theory of the sort that you might hope to unravel in your lab. What we're looking for is a staggeringly implausible theory. We don't want a plausible theory, because if it were plausible that life arises on a planet, then the universe would be crawling with life. And perhaps it is. All I'm saying is that if you're one of those people who believes that we are alone in the universe, then you have to stomach this rather surprising consequence that anybody who is doing research on the origin of life is wasting their time, because what we need is a can't be many examples where what we really need and seek is an implausible theory. Well, I don't think we are looking for an implausible theory, which means that I'm committed to the view that there probably is lots of life around the universe. But even so, because the number of available planets is so large, it's still possible that these islands of life are so widely separated from each other that they never have a chance of ever encountering each other, which would be rather sad. I'm now going to skip to the last chapter, chapter 12, what is a miracle? And I'm going to return to the subject of supernatural magic. In the first chapter, I used supernatural magic, used the phrase supernatural magic, to refer to things like frogs turning into princes and pumpkins turning into coaches and that sort of thing. But there's another kind of supernatural magic, or it's really the same kind, but it's a category that a lot of people believe. Nobody believes that frogs turn into princes or pumpkins turn into coaches. But lots of people believe that a prophet flew to heaven on a winged horse, and another one walked on water and turned water into wine, as this cartoon shows. Then there are spooky ghost stories that many people believe. People will tell uncanny stories like, I dreamed about a long-lost friend who I hadn't thought of for 40 years. And the very next morning, I woke up and found that he died in the night. Probably all heard stories like that. Miracle stories, rumours, get spread because people like telling stories. They spread as rumours. Nowadays with the internet, they spread as internet urban legends. This is especially one of the ways in which this happens is when somebody famous dies. Elvis Presley was seen on Mars after he died. Marilyn Monroe came back as a lettuce. Soon after Michael Jackson died in 2009, an American television crew was given a guided tour of his mansion called Neverland. And in one scene of this film, people thought they saw the ghost of Michael Jackson at the end of a long corridor. Well, I looked at the recording and I must say I wasn't that impressed, but it was enough to start rumours flying around the internet. Michael Jackson's ghost was seen all over the place, including in the hood of a car. See up there? You and I will probably recognise that these are just some clouds reflected in the car, but the eye of faith can see the face of Michael Jackson, and as you probably know, the face of Jesus and the face of the Virgin Mary are frequently seen in things like frying pans and pizzas and slices of toast. And that picture of Michael Jackson in the hood of the car is on YouTube and has received more than 15 million hits. When I was a child, my family lived in an old Tudor house, about 400 years old, called Cuckoo's, and it had wonky black Tudor beams, very old and very creaky. And not surprisingly, it had a legend about a long-dead priest hidden in a secret passage. There was a time when, if you were a priest of the wrong sort, you tended to get burned at the stake, and they used to get hidden in priest holes in houses. And this house, Cuckoo's, had a legend of a priest, and it was said that you could hear his footsteps going up the stairs, but with a spooky addition that there was one too many steps, that you heard one too many steps, and lo and behold, in the 16th century, there was an extra step in the staircase. Well, I told that story to my school friends, no doubt gained great kudos and prestige from telling this wonderful ghost story. It never occurred to me to ask how good the evidence was. It was enough that the house was old. My friends were impressed when I told them the story. People get a thrill from passing on ghost stories. And the same applies to miracle stories. If a rumour of a miracle gets written down in a book, then the rumour becomes hard to challenge, especially if the book is ancient. It becomes a tradition, and it becomes treated with greater respect for being old, when you might think it would be treated with less respect because there's been more time for it to get distorted. What about those strange stories of having a dream about a long-forgotten uncle who you haven't thought of for 40 years, and then the morning after you dream about him, you wake up to discover that he died in the night? Well, the trouble is, of course, that that sort of thing only gets spread about when it is spooky. Nobody ever says, I dreamed about this long-forgotten uncle I hadn't thought of for 40 years, and when I woke up, he had not died in the night. It's only stories that are spooky that get passed around, and we hear them, and they get written up in the newspaper, or they get talked about on the radio, and we think, how amazing, how astonishing. Sometimes you can work out what really happened in an apparently spooky coincidence. The great American physicist Richard Feynman, his wife, unfortunately, died of cancer, and the clock in her room stopped at the very moment when she died. What an amazing, spooky story. But Feynman was not a great scientist for nothing. He worked out what really happened. The clock was 40. It had a tendency to stop if you tilted it on its side. The nurse, when Mrs. Feynman died, needed to record the exact time of death for the death certificate. It was rather dark in the room, so she picked up the clock, carried it over to the window in order to see the face, tilted the face so that she could see it, and of course the clock stopped. But even if that hadn't happened, even if we hadn't been given that explanation, it still should not be an impressive, miraculous story. Because clocks stop all the time, and once again, you only tell the story. The story only gets spread around, and only grows in the telling, because stories do grow in the telling. Only gets spread around and grows in the telling if it is an amazing, miraculous, and apparently miraculous story. If we go back to the tale of the person who died in the night, very often you will hear, he died at exactly the moment when I was dreaming about him. So, well, when did he die? And the original story would have been, probably died around 3 a.m. When were you dreaming? Well, it could have been approximately 3 a.m. And before you know where you are, when the rumours start spreading around, that about and that approximately gets shaved off because it makes the story better. People enjoy telling a good story.